Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Aligarh Society for History and Archaeology, ASHA, and Ganga Jamni Foundation's joint series. Every Friday and Sunday, we bring you a series that tries to bring to you history of the Indian subcontinent. Today's session is called Sources of Medieval Indian History. Usually, in normal course of events, Professor Ali Nadeem Razavi is the face of this show, and I operate back end. But Professor Razavi is down with COVID. We hope he will be here with us for the session next weekend. Today's talk in the series called Sources of Medieval Indian History, as I said before, is an illustrated talk by Sohail Hashmi. Sohail Hashmi's talk will explore 7 centuries of syncretism, and this is syncretism literally etched in stone. Architectural vocabulary in South Asia has been waves and waves of adaptation. And so this adaptation has been done to suit form and function. It's been an adoption of stylistic features without regional and sectarian barriers. These centuries are also marked by an absorption of the unfamiliar, some of the unfamiliar structural forms, components to suit a newer aesthetic and societal requirements. So, buildings in North India that were built between the 12th and the 18th century, particularly, found a unique expression, and only a careful study, which we will be able to do with Sohail Saab today, reveal that no feature is really exclusive and unique to one culture. So, what we've been told before, that a dome is restricted to one community or one religion or a spire to the other, the architectural evidence says otherwise. So, let's explore this today. And I'm going to bring on Sohail Saab. Sohail Saab, as you all know, is a renowned filmmaker, documentary maker, and of course, he is also an author who's written variously on so many things. And I am going to bring Sohail Saab on. Good evening, Sohail Saab.
Good evening, Shagusta.
How are
Thank you
you
very much
doing?
for giving me the opportunity to talk to the those who have been following the Asha series, and I'm extremely grateful to Professor Ali Nadeem Rizavi, who had asked me to speak. And this, I must say, is a great honor because for somebody who's not a historian to be invited to speak to historians. So that I must say is an unqualified honor for me. Thank you very much.
You absolutely deserve this. And I want to also add that the audience primarily is people who are interested in history, people who are keen on knowing about the past. So, yes, Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology is formed by historians and people who are trained in archaeology and otherwise. But this particular platform is for everybody, and our purpose is to democratize this understanding of the past and to bring things and aspects of the past forward for everyone. So, without further ado, let's begin this evening.
Well, what I'm going to do is today, this is a presentation which will be essentially images, almost 100 images. And I'll be talking about fairly common elements. And when you go to a structure, you go and look at a building, you already have some information. Even if you are not a trained historian or a keen observer of architecture, you already have an idea. And it is that with which you go and look at these buildings. But at times what happens is that there are details that you do not see in the larger picture, and whi- which is not surprising, which is natural. But what I'm trying to do today is through this series of images to draw your attention to the details that are normally not noticed or not registered. And through this, my attempt will be to show how this very idea of what is Islamic or Indo-Islamic, etc., etc., that these kind of terms actually have no real meaning, and that we can see in architecture how it's a gradual process of evolution, of absorption, adaptation, and assimilation of diverse influences, and some of that I would like to show today. So most of the time it is going to be concentrate on the images. The format being what it is, I would have ideally liked the entire visible screen to just have the image and not have my face as a diversion on the left. But this is the technology that we have, and so concentrate on the image. And given the size, I don't know, because most of you, I'm hoping, are watching this on your laptops. So you might be able to notice some of the images. And also, there are details that I want to draw your attention to. So I'll be, Shagufta has volunteered to help me move the cursor on where I want you to focus on. So we'll begin with this image that all of you see, and many of you would be thinking, why have I put this image upside down? Look a little carefully. This is not an upside down image. This is a reflection of the Taj in the pond. And there is somewhere where, yeah, I don't know whether you can see the cursor here. I'm able to move the cursor. Good. So you can see the actual head of the fountain there, and you can see its reflection beneath. So this is the level of the water, and these people are standing on the edge of that tank. I'm using this apparently upside down image primarily to draw your attention to the fact that the way we look at the built heritage, our point of view has already been decided for us. The way we look at things has already been decided for us by those who defined our history in the past as Hindu architecture, Islamic architecture, etc., etc. What I'm trying to do in the presentation is to invert this inverted image and to put it back on its feet. So that is why I begin with this upside down image. Next, please. So this is the title, no, the one before that. Songs sung by stones. Shagufta has already explained to you 8 centuries of adaptation, accommodation, absorption, and appropriation. Next, please. We are beginning with the picture, the kalash, the kumbh, the and the large number of names that this uh, terracotta little piece of terracotta, which has been made on a potter's wheel and then has been fired, is known with. Now, I'm beginning with this because the kalash or the earthenware pot actually is a major step in human evolution. Wheel turned pottery begins with settled agriculture, primitive settled agriculture, but people have to settle down before they can take to pottery. And pottery happens after this wheel turn pottery happens obviously after the invention of the wheel. So once this vase is made, the people who made it and those who invented the technique of firing it very soon realized, or maybe immediately after firing this terracotta thing, that you could store water in it. And this is a major step. This was a vessel in which you could store water. And this freed you from the tyranny of the river. You could, whenever you felt thirsty, you could turn this pitcher and drink from it. Before that, if you felt thirsty, no matter what time of day or night, you had to go in search of a stream or a pond or somewhere where you could drink like all other animals. The pitcher separated you, humans from animals. Animals cannot store water. And all ancient civilizations were known by the pottery they made. Can we have the next slide, please? There. The top left image is a piece of pottery from Harappa, just one piece. You can see the bull with the hump there. The slide next to it, the image next to it is pottery from Harappa. Below, below these two are images of pottery which is of Greek and Egyptian origin. And you look at all ancient civilizations, whether they were Mayans, or they were Incas, or they were the Chinese civilizations, or the Sumers, all ancient civilizations were identified by the pottery they made. That is the importance of these uh, fired terracotta things that people began to make. Indus Valley civilization was identified by a specific kind of pottery. Next, please. Now, as you see these four images, you see women carrying water. You will be hard put to find an image of a man fetching water. By this time, men have begun to take over. They have actually taken over, and all hard work has been parceled out to women, walking for miles to get water. The image on the top is one of our Aboriginal communities. Uh, Four women, one girl child, and two young kids, and they are going to fetch water, or they have returned from fetching water. The next image on the top are two girls walking after fetching water. Uh, the image on the left is from Rajasthan, uh, from Bhuj, and you can see this woman carrying the water on her head. And this is, so you can see this woman has been walking for miles to fetch this uh, kalash of water. Next, please. Four more images. The two on top are from Rajasthan. You can see that man in typical Rajasthani pagdi headgear. He is just standing and watching. The women who are carrying the water. The two images at the bottom, the one on the left, you can in the background you can see a series of concrete pillars. This is a metro train. Sorry. This is a metro line, and you have these women fetching water from a little open uh, kind of a pond where some rainwater has collected. This is Delhi. And the image on the left hand side, on the right hand side bottom, those of you who know Urdu could be would be able to identify Urdu text. You may not be able to read it, but the first three words are Pani se Zindagi. This is Pakistan. It is the same story there. Women have to go and fetch water. Next, please. Now there are these images. This is early Harappan. This is a cooking vessel. Next, please. These are also images of Harappan pottery. The three vessels, two large and one small one on the top left, are cooking vessels. The one on the right is a storage bin. The one largish earthenware pot on the left hand bottom is a burial urn, and the assortment of terracotta pieces on the right hand side are burial potteries. Now, once we made the earthenware pot and we started storing water in it, and as I had mentioned to you earlier, this is also the time when we have started doing primitive agriculture. We are sowing things and we are taking harvests. We have also learned by this time that whatever grain you sow, it the seed sprout and the plant grows, and then it gets years of whether it's wheat or corn or barley or rice or whatever, or maize, and then when the seeds ripen, the plant dies. It will come back again 1 year later. And so people learned to store grains, store them, to begin gradually to cultivate enough to last them for a year and to store them. And they began to store them in these large, this storage jar, which is from 2700 to 2000 years before the uh, what is known as the Common Era. And this is from the mature Harappan period, almost 4000 to 4700 years ago from today. The two set of images at the bottom, one is a burial urn, and there were these large urns in which entire body was placed and then it was buried. And there were other rites where people were buried in the soil, and these little things were buried with them. And this gives us an indication that the people who practiced these rituals believed in uh, an afterlife. So all ancient civilizations that believed in afterlife had this kind of. I want to dwell on this image a little more. You began to store water and you began to store grains. And the kalash or the ghada or the matka or the whatever you call it, the pot, began to represent life, sustenance, water sustenance, and because it contained seeds, so it became a sustainer of life, both water and grain. These people also knew that they had to save some grains for the next crop. And in small vessels, seeds began to be stored. Now, these small vessels, the small kalashes that contained seed for the next crop, began to be venerated. Very soon, they became symbols of life and of fertility. They began to be identified as the mother's womb because they had life in it. seeds had life, and the Kalash contained the seeds. So the Kalash very soon began to be identified with the as the Garbh Kalash. And at that time, this is before we have imagined gods in anthropomorphic form. We venerate spirits of the forest, of the river, of the mountain, of the rock, and we all ancient civilizations. I'm not only talking of civilizations that grew in India, but all over the world. They were fertility rituals. The Kalash became a symbol and something that was used in fertility rituals. It became a symbol of fertility, and then it began to be carved in temples. Initially, most of our temples, not only in India but all over the world, were temples dedicated to gods of birth and death. And fertility was a major thing, not only to have larger families, but also to have bumper crops, but also to have a growing population of cattle. And it was for this that the rituals of fertility were organized, and the initial places of veneration of where the rituals took place became the first set of temples where the Kalash began to be drawn, or when we began working on stone, to be carved. Otherwise, they would have been terracotta things and all that. And you continue to see the use of earthenware pots in all kinds of religious rituals, even today. We'll return to that a little later. Next, please. This is from Bhuj. It's not a very old image. This was taken in 2004. And if you see this array of earthenware pots, these pots contain grains, flour, whether it is wheat or makka or it is jawar or bajra or whatever. Some of these kalashes, and maybe the ones that have and they'll have pulses, and the ones on top might have salt and chili, so on and so forth. Some of them will also have the clothes that the residents of this house wear. And at least till the time when I was in school, and I did part of my schooling in Aligarh, if we went to school in clothes that were not properly ironed, one or more teacher would during the day ask us, क्या घड़े में से निकाल के पहने? And that is where people, because there were no almirahs, there were no wardrobes, that this is where you stored things. You also, the lady of the house stored, hid her money and her jewelry in these, and she knew where it was, buried in the kalash which has jowar ka atta, or in the one with the rice or whatever, and they kept on shifting it. But that is how they kept their things. Now, this is, as I was telling you, a 2004 image. You can see a little suitcase on the right bottom of this, but this is this was 2004. I don't really know whether you would still find these, but I'll not be surprised that in Bhuj and in Kutch you still find these kind of and in other parts of the country where people would still be using them as their granaries, as also their wardrobes. Next, please. Now, as I have just mentioned to you, that the Kalash begins to be carved in temples. And this is from a Jain temple. This is a pillar from a Jain temple. It is not currently inside a Jain temple. It is currently supporting the roof of the first mosque built in Delhi by Qutbuddin Aibak, wrongly called the Masjid Qubbatul Islam. That is the name that the coinage is 19th century. Before that, nobody called it Qubbatul Islam. This was known as Jami Masjid. Also, there's another term that was used for that mosque, which was Qubbat, Kubbat, Qubbatul Islam, which meant the dome of Islam, which means the kind of protection that Islam provided to all the believers. But in this mosque was built after demolishing about 2 dozen uh, temples. Some Jain, mostly Jain, some Hindu, and this is not propaganda. This is written down. This is Qutbuddin Aibak, the stone tablet that is placed on this mosque has that so many temples were material for so many temples was used. Whether all of them were demolished or some were already fallen down and the others were demolished, one doesn't know. But at least this uses material from 24 temples. And some of the details of this I want to draw your attention to. The base of the kalash. This is just decoration. The base is lotus petals. This is the kalash, and on the top, this serrated edge wheel that you see, which looks like a gear from a scooter or a car or a motorbike. The gear wheel, it is actually known as the Amalaka. The Kalash, the Amalaka, and the Lotus are three things that we will talk about in the next 15-20 minutes or so. Next, please. These are the arches of the mosque that Qutbuddin Aibak built. This is the only thing that Qutbuddin Aibak built. Everything else was reusing material. So the three sides of the mosque are material taken from temples, and there would have been one more arch here which has collapsed. So two smaller arches and one large arch. These are the arches that Qutbuddin Aibak built. Now, this is something that I want you to look at closely. You can't look at closely physically, so I have got some close-ups for you. Next, please. Next, please. Yes, this is. Go back to the old one, to the earlier one, please, for a second. This part, can you see that little pillar, electric pillar, next to the uh, pillar of the arch? There is a. You can see that faded pillar. This is the part that I'm showing you a close up of. Next, please. No, you have gone back. Next. Yes. Now this is that pillar. And now the next frame, I'll show you a close up of this bit. Next, please. This is the close up. Though it is turned 90 degrees, but this is the close up. Now, and this was built in the early 13th century. The work on the on the mosque began in 1192, and it was completed in 1193, and then Altamash added some more. So the mosque in its present form came into existence in the with the additions of Alauddin Khilji in the early 14th century. But this is how it looked like. Now I want you to look at these curlicues closely, and then look at this. This is the detail from of a Kalpa Vriksh at the Adinath temple in Rajasthan, built in the 15th century. Do you see some? common elements in these two. The treatment of stone, the carving, the curves, the details, all this. This is the arch of a mosque, and this is the roof of the Adinath temple. This is something that I'm going to be trying to draw your attention to in the remaining part of my presentation. Thank you. Next, please. Now we've been talking about the Kalash, and you see the Kalash again, and you see the lotus, and you see the lotus petals, and you have two lotus leaves hanging from the neck of the Kalash. But then you have these spikes. Now I think these spikes represent mango leaves, and if you have attended traditional weddings, whether in North India or in South India, traditional weddings that follow Brahmanic rituals, you would have certainly seen kalashes, whether earthen or metallic, lined with mango leaves. I think this is what it is. This is the base of the arch. Next, please. And those of you who understand or can read Arabic, you can very clearly identify it. It says Bismillah. Begin in the name of God. Begin in the name of Allah. And they are part of the same stone. They were carved together. The Kalash and the Bismillah. And this is what is really fascinating. Next, please. This is again, I don't know what is this format is doing it. It's turning my images on instead of turning the first image upside down, it is turning all these images on their side. This is from the is one of the pillars of the arches of the mausoleum of Shamsuddin Al-Tamash. This is the Kalash, and these are the spikes that I think are mango leaves. And this is and the mausoleum of Shamsuddin Al-Tamash is all each the base of each arch has pillars like these. This you would identify is verses from the Quran which have been given this curlicues to make them more as a decorative element. Next, please. We are continuing with the Kalash. This is the Alai Darwaza. This is Alai Darwaza has 4 gates. 3 gates have this kind of a marble base with this Kalash there. And the 4th one, which was the entry into the mosque proper, because the Alai Darwaza was a grand gate to enter into the expanded mosque, which Alauddin Khilji had expanded. And this has these pillars, with these kalashes from the base to the top of the arch. You have this double panel of kalashes. And the kalash here, this is one of the 8 gates of the mausoleum of Adam Khan. All of you know about Adam Khan. I am not going to talk to you about Adam Khan and get diverted. And this, so this is 13th century, 13th century. This is 16th century, and this is 19th century. Khazanchi ki Haveli in Chandni Chowk. And you can see the Kalash, you can see the lotus. Next, please. And now we come to the lotus. Now, as far as the lotus is concerned, I think the veneration of the lotus would probably have begun even before the veneration of the Kalash. And I think that at the time when we were animists, and all ancient civilizations, all ancient people, when it came to talking of their religious beliefs or beliefs about creation and how the world came to be, etc., etc., they were all enemies to begin. People who venerated the river, the mountain, the rock, etc., the forest, the tree, they believed everything has life, everything was animated. And I think it's around that time that somebody walking through an open space, and I would like to believe, and this is all conjecture, I would like to believe that that person was a woman. And she comes across this little puddle of water, stagnant water, filled with rotting vegetation, with earthworms, with snails, with frogs, maybe a couple of turtles, rotting vegetation, decomposing leaves, all that, mud. And in that, you had the lotus, this beautiful flower. And incidentally, I have yet to see a saffron colored flower. But aside from, leave that aside. But so she came across this beautiful flower, and she probably said to herself that you can rise above all this filth and be pure and be clean and be, not sullied and be clear of all the filth. And above all that, I think the person who came made this observation was a woman, because I think women note these things much before men do. And so I think it's from that time that the lotus became a symbol of purity. And it must have gone through word of mouth, etc., etc., and it traveled, and it became a symbol of purity. It is much after this time that we began to imagine anthropomorphic gods, gods in human shape. Because you look at all the gods imagined by all the ancient civilizations, all of them are human, are human like. All of them have 2 feet. They might have multiple arms. They might have heads of animals. And this is not something that is unique to India. Ancient Egyptian civilization had Ra, the son of God, the god of the son of the son of the sun, and his head was the head of an animal. These were attributes that human beings gave to the gods that they imagined, because all the gods finally are have attributes that make it possible for them to do everything that human beings have wanted to do and cannot do. All gods can fly. Gods can talk to animals, understand their language. They can move mountains. They can do everything that human beings have wanted to do and have not been able to. So the gods that we created out of our imagination are actually personification of our own aspirations. And it is whether they have form or not, but this is what all the gods that humans have created. And let me tell you, all gods were created by human beings. Now, you look at all these gods, all of them have families. They have wives and they have children. And the gods feel hungry. and they have to be given food at regular intervals. Food has to be offered to them. They get angry like old people like me or like little kids. And then you have to placate them. You have to do all kinds of things to please them. So people had this relationship with their gods, and they realized, because the gods were like them, not a single god anywhere has 4 feet. All of them have 2 feet. They are so much like us. And because they are so much like us, at times they would have to sit down. But they couldn't sit on the ground like us, like mere mortals. They were gods. So they would require a place which was pure. And therefore, the lotus. Next, please. There. You have Vishnu, Lord Vishnu in the Shir Sagar. And notice what is Lakshmi doing? Pressing her feet. Remember one of the earlier images that I showed you? We made the earthenware pot and gave it to the women to fetch water. Lakshmi is a goddess, but she is the consort of Vishnu. So the human imagination, which has already reduced women to servitude, even when she is a goddess, this is what she has to do: press the feet of her Lord and Master. It is this imagination that gives you ideas of Sita ki Rasoi. But that is not something that we are going to be discussing today. But here, and from the navel of Vishnu rises a lotus, and in the lotus sits Brahma. Next, please. And this is Vishnu himself, the sustainer, sitting in the lotus. Next, please. Brahma and Mahesh, both in the lotus. Also notice that when they sit in the lotus, all of them sit in the lotus mudra. It's known as the Padmasana. Next, please. Now you have Lakshmi and Saraswati. Both of them sit in their own lotuses. Next, please. Kartikeya and Ganesh. Kartikeya is the son of Shiva, Ganesh is the son of Parvati. Kartikeya is not a god that is worshipped in a major way in North India, but Kartikeya or Murugan is the major god in the south. And Ganesh, obviously. Ganesh is worshipped in the north as well as in the south, and both of them sit on the lotus. Then there were people, human beings, these are all mythological figures. But then there were human beings who were exalted, and we raised them to the status of God. And that is the next image. Next, please. Bhagwan Mahavir and Gautama the Buddha. And you notice both of them are sitting in the lotus. So these are human beings who are deified and raised to the level of godliness, and therefore they had to be seated in the lotus. Now Buddhism travels, and it travels from India, from Kashmir, it goes into Ladakh, and then into Tibet, and from Tibet to China, and from China to Japan, and so on and so forth. And see what happens in this journey. Next, please. Tibetan Buddhism imagined the feminine Buddha, Tara, and she is placed in the lotus. Normally, whenever Buddha, an image of Buddha is presented, he is always accompanied by two bodhisattvas, Vajrapani and Padmapani. Bodhisattvas are people who were born before Buddha, who had all the potential of rising to uh, Buddhism, to becoming the Buddha, but they did not. And it was only Gautama who rose to that level. But the Bodhisattvas are also very important part of the Buddhist mythology. Padmapani, who has a beautiful representation in the Ajanta frescoes, a beautiful human figure holding a lotus in his right hand. Padmapani in the Buddhism as it traveled through the Himalayas, Tibetan Buddhism, he evolves and becomes Avalokiteshvara. And you see him here. He is also one of the very few Buddhist uh, deities who's shown with multiple arms. Though I have also seen an image of Buddha of the hundred of the thousand arms. But mostly, you see Avalokiteshvara with multiple arms, seated in the lotus. Next, please. So this is Bodhisattva Padmapani Ajanta. Next, please. And now we come back to that mosque built by Qutbuddin Aibak. And now the Arabic word that you can see on the left image is Al Masjid. The Alif and Lam. Alif you can't see, but the L you can see of Al and then no, this is the Alif and this is the Lam and Masjid. Al Masjid. Next to the stroke of Lam, you see the three lotus buds. Now, I have a theory about this. I don't know whether it is correct, but this is what I would like to present before. I think when the mosque was being planned, they decided to make these arches on the facing the west wall, or facing the direction of the west. So people knew that this is the direction they have to face to pray. These that one broken arch and three whole arches that I showed you a little while ago, the shape would have been drawn first on a piece of paper or maybe on parchment. And paper, incidentally, had arrived by that time. Paper arrived in the 13th century. These are the fellows who also brought paper to India. They got it from the Chinese. So that from China, through the Silk Route, paper traveled to Central Asia, to Turkey, to Afghanistan, through the Silk Route. And then when these people came here, they brought paper to us. So on paper or on parchment, the figure of the arches would have been drawn. Master calligrapher would have also identified the Quranic verses that were to be carved. And he would have written them down where what verse has, what word has to come. Now, this would have been done on a piece of paper, A4 size, A3, A2, whatever, whatever size of paper they used in those times. And once the drawing was done, then the stonemasons were asked that this has to be done and this arch has to be, say, 60 feet. Now, massive blocks of stone began to be cut to make the arches. And on the face that was on the face of the arch of the stones that was going to be exposed to the worshippers, the text had to be carved. Now, the text that had been written on a small piece of paper, when it is expanded into 50, 60 feet tall arch, obviously, so much more space, the little space between strokes became very large. And they must have noticed it just when the first stones began to be carved. because the Masons did not know Arabic. The Masons would have been local Masons. Nobody brought Masons from wherever they were coming from. The architects came, the calligraphers came, and the local Masons were used. Like in the army, the soldiers were all local people, local peasants. So the calligrapher would have, with a thick brush, written down the verses, and he would have realized that there's so much empty space between words, and when it goes up, it's not going to look very good. And the masons would then have been asked, while you are carving this, also embellish it. Now this is where the real fun begins, because the mason is a local. The mason knows that this is what he's building is a place of worship. It's a place of worship of these new arrivals. This is in his mind, this is their temple. And this text, the whatever he's carving, is in their language, holy text. And he has now been asked to embellish it. What does he embellish it with? And he knows this is holy text. It can only be embellished with a holy flower. And there's no flower holier than the lotus. Next time you visit Delhi, hopefully after COVID is gone, hopefully it goes early, not after in the next 10 years, maybe in the next 6 months it goes away, and you have a chance to visit Delhi, please go to the Qutub and look at these arches a little closely. There are thousands of lotuses, thousands. This mosque is being built by a man who demolished 24 temples. And this is the arches of his mosque. And they're filled with lotuses. And the base of each arch is filled with kalashes. And there are images of the tree that fulfills all your wishes, the Kalpavriksha. There are motifs of the Kalpavriksha woven into the carving. This is what is the entire burden of my argument. We'll quickly show you some more, but this is please, 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 please go back, go back, go back, go back, go back. The next panel is part of an arch of the Alai Darwaza, and just see the number of lotuses. Buds, fully open lotuses, and lotuses seen from the top. And the Alai Darwaza is totally covered with lotuses. Next, please. These are two arches. This is the mausoleum of Firoz Tughlaq in what is known as Hauz Khas, and the two sides of the arch, which are these triangular spaces which remained open traditionally. It didn't have anything in it, but the Indian mason did not like these empty spaces. He thought they didn't look too good aesthetically. So what did he do? This is the mausoleum, entry to the mausoleum. He places the lotus. This is the close-up. This is a very important mosque, the Jamali Kamali, the mosque of the Sufi saint whose name was Fazlullah, who used the pen name Jamali. This was a mosque built for him by his disciples. This is the first mosque that uses the jharoka, borrowed from Rajasthani architecture. The inside of the arch has a kind of a creeper carved into the arch. These are all lotus buds. And these two are lotuses, and this is a close-up. Inside this was the bud of the lotus, which was must have been white, which has fallen off. So you have this hole. But it is not only the lotus. Around that, you see the triangle. And the triangles represent the sun. And the Muslims have never venerated the sun. Neither do they venerate the lotus. But, and this is the time of the end of the Lodhis and beginning of the Mughal era. Fazlullah died in the time of Humayun. So, and this is when the mosque is built toward the end of the Lodhis and early part of the Mughal period that this mosque is built. And you have the lotus and the sun adorning the central arch. Nobody had any problem. Nobody had any problem. The architect would certainly have asked the masons, "ये तुमने क्या बनाया? Why do you have this? What is this?" When the first lotus was carved on Firoz Tughlaq's mausoleum, somewhere else, the architect would have asked, or on the carvings on the arches of the mosque built by Qutbuddin Aibak, the architect would have asked, or the whoever was supervising would have asked, "What is this?" And he would have been told that these are symbols of purity. And who is going to object to symbols of purity? Just as they would have been told when the kalashes began to appear everywhere, "Wow, what is this?" And they were told that this is a symbol of a good omen. This symbolizes prosperity, well-being, and so on and so forth. And on the mausoleum, the kalash represented death. How do you carry the bodies, the ashes of the dead? There are graves upon graves upon graves and mausoleums after mausoleums that have kalashes carved on them. When we talk of a syncretic tradition, this is how it develops. Next, please. Now, the dome. We have been told that the dome is Islamic architecture. The largest dome is in the world is Saint Peter's Basilica, where the Pope meets the his devotees or the devotees of the Catholic faith fairly regularly. That is the largest dome and among the oldest domes in the world. The dome was first used by the Romans, pre-Christian Romans. It was the Jews who first used the dome for worship, then the Christians, then the Muslims. There are domes all over Europe. Nobody calls them Islamic. Interestingly, nobody calls them Christian also. In Europe, they are known as Gothic or Renaissance or Baroque or whatever, uh, you know, classical, neoclassical, or whatever but they are never called Christian. But in the Middle East, in South Asia, the dome is Islamic. And we have bought this and without asking any questions, swallowed it. But that is a totally different issue. But here, what is happening? The dome arrives. The Indian mason is not happy with this shape. It ends suddenly. There is nothing on top. Looks like a bald head, like my head. There's nothing on top. So the Indian mason set about completing this unfinished project. The first thing that they did was to cover it with the lotus. Why with the lotus? Because in the Central Asian imagination and in the Roman imagination, the dome represented the heavens. And in the Islamic imagination and in the imagination of all other religions as well, gods live in heavens. And in the Islamic imagination, God, Allah, lives on the seventh heaven. And the top of the dome represented the seventh heaven. So the dome was covered in a lotus because the lotus is the throne of God. You see what is happening? Two totally different religious beliefs find common ground. In the next stage, the dome, the lotus shrinks and becomes a crown. This is also a lotus. The stage after that was the dome topped with a lotus in the shape of a crown. On top of this was a kalash. In this dome, it has broken, but I think I'll have another image where I'll show you that I am not pulling a fast one. Next, please. But before you come to that, this is the inside of a dome. And I've wrongly labeled it. This is not inside the Rang Mahal. This is inside the Moti Masjid, built by Aurangzeb. This is the ceiling of the Sheesh Mahal. This is the fountain, lotus fountain inside the Rang Mahal, the palace of the junior queens, minor queens. And this is the main gate of the Badshahi Masjid built by Aurangzeb, Alamgir. And you see one, two, three. There is one on that side, four. There are two on that side, six. Six little minarets, each one ends in a lotus, and from that lotus rises a small dome. Even Aurangzeb didn't have any problem with the lotus. Next, please. The first image that I showed you of the Kalash, I also showed you that gear-shaped thing, the Amalaka. The Amalaka is normally placed above the Shikhar and below the Kalash is seen either as the lotus, the seat of the deity, or the sun. So the Amalaka represents the sun, the lotus, and the throne of gods, and it is normally placed above the Shikhar of temples. Next, please. Here. This is from Khajuraho. This is, I'm unable to see this. This is StreamYard windows covering this, but this is also an ancient temple, and this is a votive temple uh, from Ashapuri, a broken bit of an old votive temple, and this is the mausoleum of Zafar Khan, the second earliest surviving dome in Delhi. And above that, this is the Amalaka, which is topped. No, the Amalaka is the number two. The first is the lotus, then the Amalaka, and then the broken Kalash. Next, please. And then all this begins to come together. Next, please. So you have the lotus crown and the Amalaka. The lotus crown, the Amalaka, and this is a series of lotuses straight and upside down. Similarly, on Isa Khan Mausoleum, this is the Nila Gumbad, and this is a close-up of Isa Khan Mausoleum, and you can see the details. The Kalash crown, the Amalaka, upright Kalash, inward, upside down Kalash, upside lotus, upside straight lotus, and upside down lotus. Next, please. More of the same in separate building. This is incidentally Adam Khan's Mausoleum's dome. And look at the top of this. And just remember this, we'll come back to that. This is Nizamuddin Aulia's Mausoleum. This is Khairul Manazil Mosque, built by Mahamanga. Incidentally, this was a madrasa for girls. A mosque and a madrasa exclusively for girls, built by Mahamanga. Next, please. You'll remember I had talked to you about a kalash lined with mango leaves and a coconut now. You see all of these? If you have attended any traditional Brahmanic wedding that follows Brahmanic rituals, you will see these. Why the coconut? The coconut is also a symbol of the womb because the coconut also has life in it. It's a seed. And if you remember, if you have attended any of these weddings, you would also know, and even if you have not, you would know that after the Vidai takes place, the newly married girl goes to her in-laws' house. And next day or the day after, there is a ritual where she is made to sit cross-legged on the ground, and her lap is filled with all kinds of presents. And one of the things which is always there is the coconut. Coconut is also a symbol of fertility. So is the kalash. These three things are a symbol of fertility. Next, please. Remember this. And therefore, now you have them, these three shapes, two kalashes and a cone, which represents the lotus, above the Sun Temple in Chandni Chowk. This is a modern temple. This is the Gauri Shankar Mandir in Chandni Chowk. This is 18th century. This is the Gurdwara Seesganj in Chandni Chowk. This is the Gurdwara Hazur Sahib, built by Maharaja Ranjit Singh in Lahore, adjacent to the Agra Fort. And that minaret that you see at the back is the minaret of the Badshahi Masjid built by Aurangzeb. They are just next to each other. Next, please. This is the finial on Adham Khan's mosque, Adham Khan's mausoleum. One kalash, another kalash, and the cone. Above the Digambar Jain Mandir, and above the mosque in Fatehpur Sikri. Next, please. Same area. And a close up, but this is not the Fatehpur Sikri. This is the Fatehpuri Mosque. You can see one kalash here and another kalash and the cone. This is built in 1650. Next, please. And this is the dome above Nizamuddin Aulia's mausoleum and the two kalashes in the dome. But this is a much later edition. Originally, the mosque, the mausoleum was open to the skies. This was probably added the dome in the time of Farrukh Siyar or a little later. Next, please. I don't have to tell you. This is Humayun's tomb, and you look at the top. This is the original finial, and this is where this entire process of creating, finding a finial for the dome culminated at Humayun's tomb. This is where, for the first time, the two kalashes and a cone were used. And all the other places which I have shown you use the same finial. And after this Humayun's mausoleum, every dome, substantive dome, has used this finial. Interestingly, you can see the six-cornered star and the lotus. We'll talk about the six-cornered star a little later. We have talked about the lotus already. Next, please. This is the new finial. The old one broke in a major storm that came 3-4 years ago. This is an exact replica. 98.6% pure copper, made in Old Delhi, and then given a covering of gold foil, 24 karat gold foil. Don't try climbing this. There isn't too much gold in it. And it's a dangerous enterprise. Next, please. This is the Jama Masjid. The same finial. Next, please. And quickly, Moti Masjid and Fakhrul Masajid in Kashmiri Gate, also built in the time of Aurangzeb, built by Aurangzeb. Next, please. Now this swastika. Now we have been told that the swastika is Indian, is our invention. But there are these, each swastik from a different country, from a different culture. There is a Islamic swastik, there is a Christian swastik, there is a Jain swastik, there is a Greek swastik, there is a Jewish swastik, there is a Celtic swastik, and from Bali and from Hopi and all that. Next, please. And this is from the Registan Square in Samarkand. This is the mosque. When you see these swastiks, Samarkand. This is where Babar came from. Next, please. This is from the palace of Ruqayya Sultan, the senior most queen of Akbar in Fatehpur Sikri. And these two have been restored because the stones had gotten badly eroded. This is the mausoleum of Shamsuddin Muhammad Ataqa Khan. Some of you might know Ataqa Khan was killed by Adam Khan, and that is why he was put to death. Ataqa Khan was the chief of Akbar's personal bodyguards, and also Gigi Anga's husband. Gigi Anga was the wet nurse of Akbar, the second wet nurse of Akbar. And Akbar treated Ataqa Khan as an uncle. Next, please. This, can you see these swastikas? This is just 1/4 of an arch. There are 4 of these arches above each gate, and there are swastikas everywhere. One right swastika and one, one mirror reflection. And this is the mausoleum of Quli Khan, the senior commander in Akbar's army and younger brother of Adam Khan. Next, please. And you see the swastik there. This is a close-up. This is the entry to the mausoleum of Akbar. There are 6 of them on the outside and 6 of them inside. And right in the middle of the panel, this is where the stone inlay work began. And you can see the swastik very prominently there. Next, please. This is a gate of the, this is known as the picture wall, or there are a large number of tiles with which all kinds of images have been made, flowers and animals and lions and horses and all that. And this was a gate built, started by Jahangir and completed by Shah Jahan. This was then the exclusive entry of the royalty into the Lahore fort. And almost 100 yards on each side of that gate is this panel of swastiks. And these are tiles which were specifically cast for this border. So, next, please. Now, the inspiration of all the swastikas, the coming together of the North Star with one major constellation. Call it what you will. Ursa Major, Big Dipper, Big Bear, Saptarishi, Binatun Nash, the wagon or the plow. These are the names of the Binatun Nash, or the you see the big bear in the skies. Next, please. You will see the image now. Yes, this is it. You must be familiar with this. These 7. इस पर गालिब का बहुत अच्छा शेर भी है, वो फिर कभी. और ये नॉर्थ स्टार है. And these 2 always point to the North Star. Next, please. This is where in the northern hemisphere, in the summer you see it here, in spring you see it here, in winter you see it here, in the fall you see it here. And this the Ursa Major or the Big Dipper, was the pointer to the star that did not move. It did not appear to move to the viewer. And it is being suggested by astronomers that when people first came out of Africa and began their march to populate the entire world, once they came out in the desert and in the sea, the only way they could determine their directions at night was by observing the stars. And it is then that they made this connection. And that is why every ancient civilization has the swastika in one form or the other. To claim it as their own, as your copyright, is being a little too ambitious. Next, please. And now the Star of David. This is clearly, these are two triangles superimposed one on top of the other in such a way that you create six triangles. And there is a term for this triangle where all the three arms are equal and all the three angles are equal. I'm missing that term, but that is what it is. Now we are told that this is the Star of David, and we have been told that from Judaism to Christianity to Islam, the star traveled because David is a king among the Jews. In Christianity, David is presented by Jesus as one of his ancestors, and David is Dawood alayhi salam in Islam. From being a king to becoming an ancestor of Jesus to becoming a prophet, this is the journey of David, and the star has traveled with him. And we were told that it is the star was brought to India by the Muslims. So that is the story we have been told. But there is a little spin to this. Next, please. Next, please. This is where you see the Star of David or the six-cornered star for the first time in Delhi. This is the arch of the Alai Darwaza, and there are two of them. And there are three arches, each one of them with two stars. This is another angle. I've taken the same star from another angle. This is a six-cornered star inside a circle. Now, a six-cornered star inside a circle in India is known as the Adi Yantra or the Shakti Chakra. This triangle represents Shiva and this represents Shakti. And Shiva and Shakti inside a circle signify universe in harmony. This is the Indian yin and yang. Now, is it the Shakti Chakra or the Adi Yantra, or is it the Star of David? I've been trying to show you through all this that the lotus and the sun, which you find in these architects, are in these buildings constantly, are not Islamic within quotes, but you see them in all these buildings built by Muslims. And now this star. You also see it on Adam Khas mausoleum. And inside this is a lotus. Next, please. Between the Alai Darwaza and Adam Khas mausoleum was built this mosque in the Lodi Gardens. And in this, you see the six-cornered star with a lotus inside. Next, please, which is a close-up. There. You see it more clearly there. It's been shifted on its axis, but the six-cornered star is clearly there. Next, please. Oh, what has happened to this image? Next, please. Sorry, go back. This is turned on its side. I don't know why, but you can see the star of the six-cornered star. And similarly, it is there on the earlier image, which is very badly distorted. Next, please. and you can see it very clearly. This is the entry to the fort of Humayun, the Purana Qila. Next, please. And this is the mausoleum. Now, you see it in the mausoleum of Fazlullah. You see it on the Purana Qila. You see it on the mausoleum of Humayun. You see it on the mausoleum of Adam Khan. And all these buildings are built in the time of Humayun or Akbar. And Humayun has a very keen interest in astronomy. So does this six cornered star appearing on every building built in the time of Akbar or Humayun, with all these six cornered stars, does it have something to do with Humayun's interest in astronomy? Because you don't see it in later Mughal buildings, at least not in such profusion as you see them in the time of Humayun and Akbar. From Jahangir's time, Shah Jahan's time, I don't remember too much of this. Next, please. The mausoleum of Humayun we have been talking about, but just to draw your attention to, there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 16 six-cornered stars on each face. And there are 4 faces. So 64 of these six-cornered stars, with 8 of them having the lotus inside. Now, if this is the Star of David, then the lotus has been put by the Indian Mason. And if the six-cornered star is actually not the Star of David, but the Shakti Chakra, then both of them have been put there by the Indian Mason. Next, please. Now, this is a totally different section, but I think I'll stop here. If there are any questions, we can take them.
Thank you, Sohail sir. There are a few questions. I will put them up here. Nanak Ganguly asks, Timur was fond of Indian stonemasons. He brought on Indian craftsmen on his Persian design in Samarkand. Can you enlighten us on some of the syncretism that took place in the architecture of Timurids in the 15th century Asia?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Nanak Ganguly Saab, that you have asked. I have had this. I've been talking about this for a while now. That when Timur sacked Delhi and he offered his Friday prayers at the central mosque in the Kotla Firoz Shah, he is believed to have been greatly impressed by the architecture of the mosque, and he asked for a map of that, a drawing of that mosque. And it is said that when he left Delhi, he carried 600 masons from Delhi. And the Bibi Khana mosque was built after his return from Delhi. Now, all this I have picked up later. But I was struck when I saw the Begumpur Mosque for the first time. That must have been about 15 years ago or so. I just entered that mosque and I just sat down, and uh, I didn't know, because I had never been to that mosque before, but I was convinced that I had seen this before. And then weeks later, I realized that I had seen images of a mosque that looked like it. And then I went back and I kept on looking, and much later, while reading about Timur's sacking of Delhi, when I came across this, then I went back and started looking at those images, and I realized that the Bibi Khana Mosque, the central arch, if you remove the tiles from it, is an exact copy of the central arch of the Bibi Khana Mosque. So that, to my mind, settles this, that these exchanges are never one way. There is always give and take. So some kind of a mosque design came with Qutbuddin Aibak, and things kept on happening and all that. And then people were traveling between these two places constantly. There were no passports, there were no visas. People went where they wanted to go. So people went and they came back and they traveled, and artisans would have traveled, and in search of better work opportunities and all that, and especially expert craftsmen would have traveled, and things would have traveled. But this, I believe, is something that needs to be studied more systematically. This is an area for a historian to actually explore. I don't know whether it has already been, people have already worked on it, and but this is a fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. You'll need to read the questions because I am unable to, because the StreamYard.com panel is there, so I can't read the text.
Okay,
To
so the
what extent
question
there
by
is?
Nikhil Chet is, to what extent there is a grain of truth to an argument that the dome in Arabia was originally influenced by Buddhist stupa the Andakar.
Well, I think this is an absolutely baseless argument. Absolutely baseless, because the stupa is solid. The stupa is solid, and the dome cannot be built before you have mastered the arch. And there is no arch in India before the 13th century. There's somebody else had, I was speaking in Calcutta somewhere, and somebody came up with this, but this is there is no basis to this. I'm sorry.
Professor Rezavi, who's been listening in. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us, and hope you're feeling better. So, Professor Rezavi says, any significance of the pitcher or the kalash in Central Asian traditions? What do we find? We do find depictions of Surahi in Central Asian and Iranian traditions, after all.
I have absolutely no idea, Rizvi Saab, because this Kalash thing came to me because I've been seeing it constantly, but and also because of the connection to fertility that we invested the Kalash with. Uh, in ancient Iranian traditions, what were the rituals? Unless one goes into that, I don't, unless one goes into that, one may not be able to make this kind of a connection with the Surahi. The Surahi has other connections in the literary traditions of Persia, from Umar Khayyam and much before, and coming down to us up to Ghalib. But whether in architecture, whether it was used and all that, one has seen quite a lot of that in stone inlay work. There are hundreds of them in the mausoleum of Noor Jahan's parents uh, in Etmaduddaulah, and also quite a lot of that in in wall paintings in Chinika, Rosa, and places like that where they have survived. But whether they had any religious, ritualistic significance, I don't know.
Probably pre-Islamic.
And thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rizvi Saab, for honoring me with your presence. I'm really grateful,
Okay,
despite your
another
COVID.
question, which I think is very interesting. Tongue-in-cheek question. Would you not believe me that all types of floral decorations have been blindly taken as the lotus?
Where?
पत्थरों पे
In,
या पेंटिंग्स में कुछ भी बहुत सारे जो फ्लोरल डेकोरेशंस हैं, क्या वो सब की सब को लोटस माना जा सकता है? बहुत सारे हैं.
सब नहीं नहीं, सबको तुम आई डोंट थिंक सबको मान सकते हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल द मोड, स्पेशली इन द ड्यूरिंग द मुगल पीरियड, the lotus, the tulip, lala, appears again and again, and the red fort especially is filled with chrysanthemums, thousands of them. So, and inside the hammam, I was fortunate to go inside the hammam in Red Fort and take a very large number of photographs. There are all kinds of flowering trees, and inside the hammam, incidentally, there are no lotuses. So, except on the stone inlay work in the on the floor near the throne, because Shah Jahan used to have a throne inside the hammam also, and there is a lotus in the stone inlay there. But aside from that, all the wall paintings and frescoes, there are no lotuses there.
So, question from Dr. Mishra from Ravenshaw University. So, he's writing in from Orissa. Why do you think that the idea of lotus motifs are drawn from Bengal?
I've never said that. I didn't say
Okay.
that.
Okay. So, right. So, anyways, he's goes on to explaining that it's also used in Jain iconography. Kartikeya has been impregnated indirectly through the semen of Shiva. He decided to live in South India as he did not like to confront Ganesh, who's an embodiment of knowledge. It was wonderful articulation, and thank you so much for the nice comparison. Okay, so one question.
No, no, but let me react to this. Uh, you see, Bengal and Odisha did not exist at the time when we were talking about as political religious entities. So, this division of the fight that is going on between Odisha and Bengal, I think, let's not project it back into the past. The fight between Rasgulla and all that, let's not take it back 500 years ago, 700 years ago. And well, certainly, and so when I'm talking of the lotus, I am talking of a time when we are all animists. So there are no national borders. People are traveling all over the world. I am talking of that time, and the veneration of the lotus I am tracing to that time, not to present history. Yeah, and the rest what you are saying about, absolutely, you know, how it is constantly, being used in Jaina iconography, in Buddhist iconography, all over. And this the issue of Shiva and Kartikeya was just a passing reference, but I'm not engaging with that.
Manas Sinha asks, Suhail sir, I think Buddhism traveled from Bengal to Tibet and not from Kashmir. It was taken to Tibet by Atisha Dipankara. Could you confirm, please?
Well, again, these this is actually nitpicking. The fact remains that the third major conference of Buddhism happened in Kashmir, and Ladakh is next door. Yeah, next, please.
Dipin Sharma, sir, as you said, lotus and mango leaves were integrated with new types of architecture coming in. How was how did the new architecture influence the existing architecture of the land?
Well, if you look at the buildings that were being built in the 14th century, 15th century, you can see, as I was saying, that these influences are never one way. The arch, which was first used in India in 1287, from then onwards, the arch becomes a permanent fixture
Mm.
And you go to Rajasthan, you go to Madhya Pradesh, you go all over. The arch is everywhere. The arch came from outside. What is now outside for us? It did not evolve in India. It did not even evolve in Iran or Afghanistan. The arch evolved in Sumeria, in Sumer. It is the Romans who borrowed the arch from the Sumerians and began to use it over ground. And then from there it spread. And unfortunately, I have not taken up that section on the arch where I have traced the journey of the arch, and that is how it traveled. And then it is a permanent fixture in. You go to any small town and you go to any middle class house, and you will see the arch. So, and the arch made it possible for you to build long verandas. That possibility did not exist earlier.
Mm. The next one is more like a comment, I think an observation by John Matthew. I'm just guessing whether we interpret the dome as an inverted kalash, which signifies the presence of divine fertility, newness on earth, as the dome was predominantly used in religious places like temple, mosque, church, or even in the Buddhist vihar and in Sufi dargahs.
Well, you see, quite a lot of these explanations are post facto. When the dome has come, then you begin to, including the idea that the dome represents the heavens. Because if you look at it, the first time that a dome was created, it was used for a secular, it was first used for a secular purpose. It was for the Roman Parliament, for the Roman Senate. They were looking for an architectural form where everybody could see everybody else. And it is this need to have a large enclosed space where everybody can see everybody else that creates the dome. Once the dome comes into existence, the denominational religions begin to use it. And the Jews, there was no Christianity then, there was no Islam. The only congregational religion that existed at that time were the Jews. And they were the first to begin using the dome as a place where the congregation could meet. And then it was used by the Christians and then by the Muslims. But just note a very interesting thing. The original use for which the dome was created, the dome continues to be put to that use in a large part of the world. Look at the number of parliaments that have circular dome-like structures. Because to my mind, the dome is the first democratic space. Everybody sits around in a circle. There is no head of the table. This is how in ancient tribal communities, when the tribe people meet, everybody sits around in a circle. It is this form which lends itself to equal debate, equal exchange of ideas, and all that. It gets distorted by religious organizations into creating one-way dialogues. One-way discourses. There are no dialogues. There is the priest who pontificates, and everybody is supposed to listen. But the form of the dome is actually a very democratic form. And now one can say this is an inverted lotus and all that. But when the dome was built, those fellows, I don't think, had the idea of the lotus.
I think Nanak Ganguly also says this, it resonates with him as well. And he says it would be impossible to believe that religion did not provide inspiration in European nations, and yet we never come across religion centered vocabulary, even for distinctively religious structures. Terms are invariably functional, region specific, or people specific, So, it could be Celtic or Neo-Gothic, Gothic, classical, neoclassical, and Roman lettering contrast this with Islamic Gaelic. So sort of we do not say that this is a Catholic spire or this is the Protestant steeple or this is a methodical steeple or
Absolutely.
something like that.
Absolutely.
So I think that's what he's saying. So here we are coming to an end of this program today. It's been an hour and 40 minutes. And on behalf of ASHA, Aligarh Society for History and Archaeology, and Ganga Jamni Foundation, I want to thank you very, very much for accepting this invitation. And we wish Professor Rizavi a speedy recovery, and hopefully, we will see him next weekend. I want to also inform everyone here that on Sunday, there's going to be a very interesting talk by Dr. Ursula Weeks. And Dr. Ursula Weeks will be talking to you all about this very fascinating interface, this kind of coming together of the Mughals and the Dervishes, the Mughals and the Sufis and the Sants. So there's going to be a lot of information there about the Mughal rulers, princes, princesses, or queens meeting the Jogis or the Vaishnav saints or sometimes Sufi dervishes. So we will be we look forward to that as well. Sunday 8 p.m. Here on the same portals. Thank you so much, Sohail Saab. I want to thank
Thank you,
you.
Gauri.
And
Thank
all right. So Rupa Abdi thinks that the story behind the swastik was very interesting indeed.
My
So
best
how do you
wishes
get?
to Professor Rizavi. I hope he's up and about soon. And
Yeah,
thank you
Professor
very much.
Izavi, it's getting a little difficult without you. People miss you. So, so how to get the link? So Nilakshi, you just join, log into @Ganga Jamuni Heritage on Facebook or on YouTube, and also on this Facebook group called the History Learner. And you can log into Asha YouTube channel. So I will provide all the links to you, and these will be available. So you can come to @Ganga Jamuni Heritage on Sunday at 8 o'clock. So, wow, so lots of so many familiar people. Thank you, Richa, for joining us. Hope you're all keeping well and staying safe. Dr. Richa Prasad goes to the hospital. She's one of the frontline workers. So, thank you so much, guys, for being there. And all right, thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much.